coffee was still warm when Sherri Rasmussen's life ended on Balboa Boulevard in 1986, Van Nuys, California, population threading through the San Fernando Valley like a promise of suburban safety. February 24th arrived with morning fog that would burn off by noon, revealing a community where neighbors knew each other's routines and front doors stayed unlocked during daylight hours. At 7:20 a.m., 29-year-old Sherri had kissed her husband John goodbye as he left for his engineering job at Micropolis Corporation. She was staying home with a back injury, planning to skip her nursing supervisor presentation at UCLA Medical Center. The newly married couple had been living in their Balboa Boulevard condo for just 3 months, still arranging wedding gifts and building their life together. What happened in the next 5 hours would shatter more than just their living room window. Neighbors would later remember hearing sounds of a struggle around midday, voices raised, something heavy hitting the floor, then silence that stretched like a held breath. Mrs. Martinez next door noticed the garage door standing open when it should have been closed. The mailman saw broken glass glittering on the driveway as he approached with the day's delivery. John called home repeatedly that afternoon, getting no answer. When he finally arrived at 5:15 p.m., he found their front door ajar, the security chain dangling. Inside, electronics were stacked in the living room as if prepared for transport. Their BMW was missing. Sherri lay on the floor beneath a quilted blanket, 3 bullet holes piercing the fabric. Police called it a burglary gone wrong, a home invasion that had spiraled into tragedy. But 23 years later, a discarded coffee cup in a Costco parking lot would reveal a truth hiding in plain sight. Sometimes justice wears a badge, and sometimes that badge belongs to the killer. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Sherri Rasmussen had always been different from other children. While her friends in Tucson played house or watched cartoons, she organized her younger siblings like a tiny drill sergeant, making sure they finished homework before dinner and brushed their teeth without being reminded. Her father, Nels, watched with quiet pride as his eldest daughter showed the kind of natural leadership that couldn't be taught. By age 16, Sherri had already decided on nursing. She blazed through her prerequisite courses, graduated early from high school, and entered the University of Arizona's accelerated nursing program with the kind of focused determination that impressed professors twice her age. She wasn't just smart, she was driven by something deeper than ambition. She genuinely wanted to help people heal. "That girl's got healing hands," her clinical instructor used to say, watching Sherri work with patients who responded to her gentle touch and steady voice. She could calm a frightened child with a smile, reassure an elderly patient with quiet confidence, and somehow make the most routine medical procedure feel safe and dignified. After graduation, Sherri moved to Southern California, where the hospitals were bigger and the opportunities more challenging. She landed a position at UCLA Medical Center, quickly moving up from staff nurse to charge nurse to nursing supervisor. Her colleagues respected her competence, but more than that, they trusted her judgment. When Sherri Rasmussen said something needed attention, people listened. In her personal life, she remained close to her family, especially Nels. They talked on the phone weekly, sharing everything from work frustrations to dating stories to her dreams of eventually teaching nursing full-time. Sherri had inherited her father's directness and her mother, Loretta's warmth, a combination that made her both formidable and beloved. Living in Van Nuys, she rented a small apartment near the hospital and settled into the rhythm of California life. She was 27, successful and ready for the next chapter when she attended a party in Glendale in the summer of 1984. That's where she met John Ruetten, a quiet engineer with kind eyes and a shy smile who worked for a computer company called Micropolis. John Ruetten was everything Sherri hadn't expected to fall for. Where she was outgoing and decisive, he was reserved and thoughtful. Where she attacked problems head-on, he preferred to think things through from every angle. Along with his gentle nature and sharp intelligence drew her in immediately. Their courtship moved at the speed of two busy professionals who had found something rare. John would drive from his apartment in Torrance to pick Sherri up after her hospital shifts, sometimes arriving at midnight when she finished late. They'd grab coffee and talk until dawn about everything: his work designing computer storage systems, her dreams of teaching nursing students, their shared love of hiking and skiing. By Christmas 1984, they were inseparable. By spring 1985, they were engaged. Sherri called her father with the news, her voice bubbling with happiness. "Dad, I found him. I found the one I want to spend my life with." But John carried baggage from his past that would soon threaten their future. Before Sherri, he had dated Stephanie Lazarus, a UCLA police officer who was as ambitious and driven as she was possessive. Their relationship had been intense but troubled, marked by Stephanie's jealousy and need for control. When John finally ended things to be with Sherri, Stephanie had not taken it well. The first sign of trouble came at Sherri's workplace. Stephanie showed up at UCLA Medical Center one afternoon, claiming she needed to speak with Sherri about John. She was in uniform, her badge and gun prominently displayed, her manner official but with an undertone that made Sherri uncomfortable. "I just want you to know that John and I have a history," Stephanie said, her eyes never leaving Sherri's face. "A long history that doesn't just disappear because he's with someone new." Sherri handled the confrontation with her characteristic directness. "John and I are engaged," she said calmly. "Whatever history you two have, it's in the past. You need to respect that." But Stephanie's visits didn't stop. She appeared at the hospital again, then at the restaurant where Sherri and John sometimes had dinner, always with the same message wrapped in increasingly pointed warnings. John's attempts to reason with his ex-girlfriend only seemed to encourage her persistence. When Sherri told her father about the confrontations, Nels's voice grew serious. "That woman's not respecting boundaries, honey. You be careful around her." The wedding took place on November 16, 1985, in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Sherri wore her mother's pearl necklace and carried white roses. John, nervous but beaming, fumbled slightly with his vows but delivered them with such obvious sincerity that several guests wiped away tears. The reception was held at a modest venue in Glendale, filled with laughter, dancing, and toasts that went on well into the evening. After a honeymoon in Mexico, the newlyweds moved into a ground-floor condominium on Balboa Boulevard in Van Nuys. It was a modest but comfortable place in a gated complex, with 2 bedrooms, a small patio, and enough space for the life they planned to build together. Sherri threw herself into decorating, arranging wedding gifts and making the space feel like home, but their happiness was shadowed by Stephanie Lazarus's continued intrusions. One morning in December, John discovered a container of ski wax sitting on their front porch. He recognized it immediately. It was the expensive brand that Stephanie always used, and she knew he had planned a ski trip with Sherri for the holidays. The message was clear. She was watching, she knew their plans, and she wanted them to know it. The most disturbing incident came in January 1986. Sherri was getting ready for work when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find Stephanie Lazarus standing there in full LAPD uniform, service weapon on her hip, badge gleaming on her chest. She claimed she was in the neighborhood and thought she'd stop by to see how they were settling in. "Nice place," Stephanie said, inviting herself into the living room and looking around with the proprietary air of someone conducting an inspection. "Very cozy." John always liked cozy places. Sherri stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching this woman who had no business being in her home examine her furniture, her wedding photos, her private space. The visit lasted only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Stephanie finally left, Sherri locked the door behind her and immediately called John at work. "She was here," Sherri said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. "In our house, looking around like she owned the place." That evening, John tried to minimize the incident. "She was just being friendly," he said. though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it himself. Maybe she was genuinely trying to make peace, but Sherri knew better. This wasn't about making peace. This was about marking territory, sending a message, letting them know that Stephanie Lazarus would not simply disappear from their lives just because they wished her to. The phone calls started in late January. They would ring at odd hours. Early morning before John left for work, late evening after they'd gone to bed, sometimes in the middle of the night. When Sherri answered, there would be silence on the other end, followed by a slow hang-up. When John answered, the caller would disconnect immediately. Sherri began keeping a log of the calls, noting dates and times with the systematic precision she brought to her nursing documentation. She also started paying attention to her surroundings in ways she never had before. Walking from her car to the hospital, she found herself checking shadows and scanning faces. Driving home from work, she noticed when the same vehicle appeared in her rearview mirror several times. "I think she's following me," Sherri told her father during one of their weekly phone calls. "I can't prove it, but I feel like I'm being watched." Nelson's concern was immediate and practical. "What does John say? He thinks I'm being paranoid. Says it's just coincidence, that I'm letting my imagination run away with me." Sherri's voice carried frustration and hurt. "But Dad, I know what I'm seeing. Sometimes she's not even in uniform. Different clothes, different car, but it's her." At Nell's urging, Sherri and John installed a security system in their condo. They changed their phone number and made it unlisted. They started being more careful about their routines, varying their departure and arrival times, avoiding predictable patterns. But the sense of being watched persisted. The harassment escalated in February. Their car was keyed while parked at a restaurant. Someone left tire marks on their assigned parking space at the condo complex. Sherri found her hospital locker tampered with, though nothing was taken. Each incident was minor on its own, but together they created a pattern of intimidation that left Sherri constantly on edge. On February 23rd, the day before the murder, Sherri woke up with severe back pain. She'd been dealing with minor back problems for weeks, but this morning the pain was intense enough that she could barely get out of bed. She had an important presentation scheduled at UCLA Medical Center, a proposal for a new training program that she'd been working on for months. "I should call in sick," she told John as he got dressed for work. "My back is killing me, and I can barely stand up straight." John, already running late, kissed her forehead and grabbed his briefcase. "Take some aspirin and see how you feel in a few hours," he suggested. "You've been working on that presentation forever. It would be a shame to postpone it now." But as John's car disappeared down Balboa Boulevard, Sherri made the decision that would save her from having to present her training proposal, but cost her everything else. She called her supervisor and said she wouldn't be coming in. The morning of February 24, 1986, began like any other Monday in the Ruetten household. John's alarm went off at 6:30, followed by the familiar routine of shower, coffee, and the search for a clean shirt while Sherri dozed fitfully, her back still aching from the previous day. "You sure you'll be okay by yourself?" John asked, adjusting his tie in the bedroom mirror. He was concerned but also distracted by the day ahead. An important presentation to Macropolis executives about a new storage system he'd been developing. "I'll be fine," Sherri replied, though she was already mentally preparing to call in sick again. "Maybe I'll try some heat, take a long bath. The presentation can wait another day." John kissed her goodbye at 7:20 IM, the same time he left every Monday through Friday. Sherri heard his car start in the driveway, listened to the sound fade as he headed toward the freeway. She dozed for another hour, then called UCLA Medical Center to confirm she wouldn't be coming in. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Sherri made coffee, attempted some gentle stretching exercises, and settled in the living room with a heating pad and a book. Through the sliding glass door, she could see the small patio, where John had been planning to set up a barbecue area for summer entertaining. Around 10:30, Mrs. Martinez next door noticed that the Ruettens' garage door was standing open. This struck her as odd because Sherri and John were usually very careful about home security, always closing and locking doors behind them. She made a mental note to mention it if she saw them later. At 11:15, the mailman saw broken glass scattered on the driveway as he approached the Ruetten condo. He paused, looking up at the building, but saw nothing obviously wrong. The front door was closed, the windows intact from what he could see. He delivered the mail and continued on his route, though something about the glittering fragments on the concrete stayed with him. By noon, neighbors in the normally quiet complex began hearing sounds that would later prove difficult to describe precisely. Raised voices, one definitely female, the other harder to identify. Something that might have been furniture being overturned. A sound like someone running across a hardwood floor. Then silence that stretched and deepened until it seemed to fill the entire building. The cleaning lady for the unit above the Ruettens was working in an upstairs bathroom when she heard what sounded like heavy objects hitting the floor below. 3 distinct thuds, spaced several seconds apart. Then, nothing. She continued her work, assuming someone was moving furniture or doing renovation work. By mid-afternoon, the complex had returned to its usual quiet routine. Children would be coming home from school soon. Adults would begin arriving from work. The ordinary rhythms of suburban life would resume. But something fundamental had already been broken. John tried calling home 3 times that afternoon, each call going straight to the answering machine. This was unusual. Sherri almost always answered the phone when she was homesick, even if just to complain about her symptoms or update him on how she was feeling. By 4 o'clock, he was beginning to worry. At 5:15 p.m., John pulled into the driveway of their Balboa Boulevard condo and immediately noticed the broken glass Mrs. Martinez had seen that morning. Looking up at their unit, he saw that the front door was slightly ajar, the security chain hanging loose like a broken promise. Inside, the living room looked like a tornado had struck. Their television and VCR were stacked near the front door as if someone had been preparing to carry them away. The coffee table was overturned. Sherri's purse sat open on the floor, contents scattered. But their jewelry box on the bedroom dresser remained untouched, and Sherri's expensive watch was still on the bathroom counter. John called Sherri's name as he moved through the condo, his voice growing more desperate with each room. In the living room, he found her body beneath a quilted blanket that they normally kept on the back of the sofa. 3 bullet holes pierced the fabric in a neat pattern. He checked for a pulse with trembling fingers, though he already knew from the stillness, the terrible stillness, that his wife was gone. The first police officers arrived within minutes of John's 911 call. Detective Lyle Mayer, a veteran investigator with the Van Nuys division, took one look at the scene and immediately formed his theory: burglary gone wrong. The stacked electronics, the missing BMW, the apparent struggle, all of it fit the pattern of residential break-ins that had been plaguing the area. But the crime scene contained anomalies that would later prove significant. The victim had clearly fought her attacker. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms. More puzzling, there appeared to be a bite mark on her left forearm. The forensic technician carefully swabbed the wound, collecting saliva that contained the attacker's DNA. "Looks like she put up quite a fight," the technician observed, sealing the swab in an evidence envelope. "This bite mark is pretty clear. Should be good for comparison if we get a suspect." The evidence was logged, photographed, and filed away in what would become a steadily growing collection of forensic materials that told a story no one was yet prepared to hear. Detective Mayer interviewed John that evening, focusing on the missing BMW and whether Sherri kept cash or other valuables in the house. John answered the questions mechanically, still in shock, occasionally asking when they thought they might catch whoever did this. "We're going to do everything we can," Mayer assured him. "Looks like a burglary that got out of hand. The perpetrator probably panicked when your wife came home unexpectedly." We'll canvass the neighborhood, check with other agencies about similar crimes. These cases usually solve themselves pretty quickly. But privately, Mayer was already classifying this as what cops called a burglary gone bad, the kind of case that generated paperwork and overtime, but rarely resulted in arrests. When Nels and Loretta Rasmussen arrived in Los Angeles 2 days after their daughter's murder, they came with questions that the LAPD wasn't prepared to answer. Nels brought with him a small notebook where he had carefully documented every incident Sherri had reported about Stephanie Lazarus. The workplace confrontations, the uninvited home visit, the hang-up phone calls, the sense of being followed. "My daughter was afraid of this woman," Nels told Detective Mayer during their first meeting. "She told me specifically that she thought Stephanie Lazarus was stalking her. This wasn't some random break-in." Mayer listened politely but without obvious interest. He had already committed to the burglary theory, and this grieving father's suspicions about his daughter's husband's ex-girlfriend sounded like the kind of family drama that complicated straightforward cases. "Mr. Rasmussen, I understand you're looking for answers," Mayer said, "but we have physical evidence that points to a burglary. The car's missing, electronics were staged for removal, the door was forced. Your daughter was probably just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Loretta, sitting beside her husband, spoke up quietly. "Sherri called me 2 weeks ago. She was scared. She said this woman had been to their house, had looked through their things like she owned the place." "That doesn't sound like someone who would randomly burglarize the same house." "Sometimes coincidences happen," Mayer replied. "People get focused on one theory and try to make everything fit, but the evidence tells us what really happened here." Nelson opened his notebook and began reading from pages of careful documentation. Dates, times, locations where Sherri had reported seeing Stephanie Lazarus, the ski wax incident, the uniform visit to their home, the harassment at UCLA Medical Center. As he read, his voice grew steadier and more forceful. "This woman is a police officer," he said, looking directly at Mayer. "She has training in weapons." He said, "Wallace Rayner, she has training in weapons. She knows how to make a scene look like something it's not. And she had motive. Jealousy, obsession, whatever you want to call it." But Mayer was already shaking his head. "Mr. Rasmussen, I know you're grieving, and you want someone to blame. But we can't investigate every person who ever had a disagreement with a victim. We followed the evidence, and the evidence points to a burglary." After the meeting, Nels sat in his rental car outside the Van Nuys police station and wrote one name in his notebook, underlining it twice: Stephanie Lazarus. He knew that no matter what the detectives believed, no matter how much they wanted this to be a simple case with a simple explanation, his daughter had died because someone she feared had finally acted on that fear. He also knew that getting the LAPD to investigate one of their own was going to be the fight of his life. The official narrative crystallized quickly. Sherri Rasmussen had been the victim of a residential burglary that had escalated to murder when she interrupted the intruder. The missing BMW supported this theory, as did the electronics stacked near the front door. A similar break-in had occurred 3 blocks away the week before, reinforcing the idea that a burglar was working the neighborhood. Detective Mayer briefed his supervisors with confidence. The case would likely be solved within weeks once the stolen car surfaced, or someone tried to fence the missing electronics. These crimes usually unraveled quickly because the perpetrators were typically drug users or petty criminals who made mistakes and left trails. The forensic evidence was cataloged and stored. The bite mark swab was filed away in a freezer at the LAPD crime lab, along with other biological samples that might prove useful if they ever developed a suspect. The 3 bullet casings found at the scene were compared against databases of weapons used in other crimes, but no matches emerged. John provided investigators with detailed descriptions of everything that appeared to be missing. The BMW, a small amount of cash Sherri kept in her purse, possibly some electronics, though it was hard to be certain since the living room had been so thoroughly ransacked. Insurance adjusters visited the condo, documenting damage and authorizing repairs. The case generated the usual flurry of initial activity. Patrol officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual on February 24th. Detectives checked with local pawn shops and auto theft units. The BMW's license plate was entered into national crime databases. Tips were logged and investigated, though most led nowhere. Within 6 weeks, the active investigation had slowed to a crawl. No suspects had emerged. The stolen car hadn't surfaced. No one had tried to sell electronics matching the descriptions of the missing items. The case was beginning to feel like what investigators sometimes called a stone-cold whodunit, a crime with no witnesses, no clear suspects, and no obvious path forward. When Nels called Detective Mayer to inquire about progress, he was told that investigations sometimes took time, that they were still following leads, that they would contact him as soon as there were developments. But Mayer's tone suggested that he wasn't expecting developments anytime soon. "Your daughter was the victim of a random crime," Mayer told Nels during one particularly frustrating phone conversation. "I know that's hard to accept, but sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason we can understand." But Nels wasn't ready to accept randomness as an explanation. He had spent his life as a practical man who solved problems by gathering information and thinking systematically. He wasn't about to stop now. "You're wrong," he told Mayer. "And someday you're going to realize how wrong you are." As spring became summer and summer became fall, the Rasmussen murder case grew cold in every official sense. Detective Mayer moved on to newer cases with fresher leads. The murder book, the thick folder containing all reports, photographs, and evidence logs, was transferred to a storage room where it would wait indefinitely for new developments that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. Nels refused to let the case disappear into bureaucratic limbo. He called the Van Nuys Detective Division weekly, sometimes daily, asking about progress and pushing for renewed attention to his daughter's case. The conversations grew shorter and less patient as months passed. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Rasmussen," became the standard response. Then, "I'll have Detective Mayer call you back," though the return calls came less frequently. Eventually, when Nels called the main number, he was often transferred from one extension to another until someone would tell him that the detective handling his daughter's case wasn't available. Frustrated but not defeated, Nels and Loretta took out a second mortgage on their Tucson home to fund a $10,000 0-cents reward for information leading to Sherri's killer. They had flyers printed and posted them throughout Van Nuys, hoping someone had seen something, remembered something, knew something that could break the case open. The reward generated dozens of phone calls, but no credible leads. Psychics called claiming to have visions about the murder. Criminals looking to trade information for reduced sentences on their own charges offered vague theories. A few neighbors came forward with minor details they had forgotten to mention earlier, but nothing that changed the investigation's direction. By Christmas 1986, nearly a year after Sherri's murder, the case files were officially transferred to the cold case storage facility. Detective Mayer completed his final report, concluding that despite extensive investigation, no viable suspects had been identified in what appeared to be a residential burglary that had escalated to homicide. The murder weapon was never found. The BMW was never recovered. The electronics that had been stacked for removal were never located in any pawn shop or second-hand store. For all practical purposes, Sherri Rasmussen's killer had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that the LAPD seemed increasingly unwilling to pursue. John Ruetten's grief took the form of restless motion, unable to bear staying in the Balboa Boulevard condo where he had found his wife's body. He took a leave of absence from Metropolis and moved back in with his parents in Torrance. When he returned to work 3 months later, he threw himself into his engineering projects with the kind of obsessive focus that his colleagues recognized as a form of emotional self-medication. By the end of 1987, John had accepted a transfer to Micropolis's San Diego facility. The change of scenery was supposed to help him move forward, but the ghosts of his life with Sherri followed him south. He rented a small apartment near the beach and tried to rebuild a routine that didn't include phone calls to a wife who would never answer. Dating seemed impossible at first. How do you explain to someone new that your previous relationship ended with murder? How do you trust your judgment about people when your ex-girlfriend might have killed your wife? The few times John tried to go out with women his colleagues introduced him to, he found himself distracted and distant, unable to fully engage. In 1989, 3 years after Sherri's death, John took a vacation to Hawaii. He was sitting alone at a hotel bar in Maui when a familiar voice said his name. He turned to find Stephanie Lazarus standing behind him, looking exactly as he remembered her, athletic, confident, wearing the kind of casual vacation clothes that somehow still looked official on her. "What are the odds?" she said, sliding onto the bar stool next to him. "Running into you here?" They talked for 2 hours. Stephanie told him about her career progression within the LAPD, her recent promotion to detective, her assignment to the art theft unit. She expressed sympathy about Sherri's death with what seemed like genuine emotion, saying how sorry she was that such a terrible thing had happened and asking if the police had ever found who was responsible. John found himself relaxing in her presence for the first time since Sherri's murder. Here was someone who had known him before tragedy had redefined his life. Someone who didn't look at him with pity or uncomfortable curiosity. They had dinner together that night, and John felt something that had been missing from his life for 3 years: normalcy. The Hawaii encounter led to occasional phone calls and a few dinners when John visited Los Angeles on business. Nothing romantic developed between them, but their renewed friendship provided John with a connection to his life before grief had consumed everything. It was during one of these dinners in 1990 that John finally asked the question that had been nagging at him for 4 years. "Do you think there's any chance someone I knew could have killed Sherri? I mean, the whole burglary thing never really made sense to me." Stephanie listened with the professional attention of a detective, asking careful questions about the crime scene, the missing items, the police investigation. When John finished describing his doubts about the official theory, she was quiet for a long moment. "I think you should trust the detectives who worked the case," she finally said. "They're professionals. They see patterns that regular people miss. Sometimes random violence just happens and there's no deeper explanation." But that night, driving home to San Diego, John found himself wondering why his ex-girlfriend's answer had felt more like a deflection than reassurance. Nels Rasmussen's war with the LAPD escalated throughout the early 1990s. What had begun as a grieving father's questions had evolved into a systematic campaign to force official attention back onto his daughter's unsolved murder. He wrote letters to Police Chief Daryl Gates, attended community meetings where he raised questions about cold cases, and contacted crime writers like Ann Rule, hoping to interest them in Sherri's story. His persistence made him unpopular within the Van Nuys Detective Division. Officers began referring to him as that guy who won't let go, and the father who thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. When he called with new information or questions about old evidence, he was often told that the detective handling his case was unavailable, in court, or on vacation. In 1993, Nels read a newspaper article about advances in DNA testing that were helping solve cold cases across the country. He immediately called Detective Mayer's replacement, Detective Rodriguez, and offered to pay for DNA testing on any biological evidence collected from his daughter's crime scene. "Mr. Rasmussen, we appreciate your willingness to help," Rodriguez told him during a phone conversation that Nels recorded with his permission. "But DNA testing is expensive and we need to prioritize cases where we already have viable suspects. Your daughter's case doesn't have any suspects at this time. What about the bite mark? Nels pressed. You took a swab from her arm. Couldn't you test that? Even if we did test it, what would we compare it to? Rodriguez replied. We'd need a suspect to test against. DNA doesn't solve cases by itself. It confirms what we already suspect. But Nels had done his research. He knew that DNA evidence could be entered into databases and compared against samples from other crimes. He knew that biological evidence could sit in storage for years and still provide useful information when technology advanced. He also knew that the LAPD was refusing to pursue the most obvious avenue of investigation, Stephanie Lazarus. What if I gave you a name? Nels asked. What if I told you exactly who I think killed my daughter? Mr. Rasmussen. Rodriguez's voice took on a weary tone that suggested this conversation had happened before. We've been through this. Your theory about your son-in-law's ex-girlfriend doesn't fit the evidence. We have no indication that this was anything other than a burglary gone wrong. After hanging up, Nels sat in his home office surrounded by files, photographs, and timelines he had created to document every aspect of Sherri's murder. On his desk was a framed photo of his daughter in her nursing uniform, smiling with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve. I won't give up, honey, he said to the photograph. I promise, I won't give up. His wife Loretta found him there hours later, still staring at the files, still making plans. She knew that her husband's obsession with their daughter's case was consuming his life. But she also knew that stopping the fight would feel like abandoning Sherri a second time. Jennifer Francis had been working as a criminalist in the LAPD's crime lab for 8 years when she discovered the bite mark swab from the Rasmussen case in 2004. She was conducting an inventory of old biological evidence, looking for samples that might benefit from advances in DNA testing technology, when she came across the carefully preserved saliva sample taken from Sherri's arm 18 years earlier. The case file made for disturbing reading. A young nurse murdered in her home, the crime scene staged to look like a burglary. The investigation stalled for lack of suspect. Francis had seen plenty of unsolved cases during her career, but something about this one struck her as different. The bite mark suggested a level of personal violence that didn't fit with random burglary. The missing jewelry box contents contrasted oddly with the untouched, expensive items left behind. Francis ran the DNA profile through the available databases and got no hits. But the sample was clear and complete. Whoever had bitten Sherri Rasmussen had left behind genetic material that would be perfect for comparison if a suspect ever emerged. She wrote a report recommending that the case be re-examined in light of the DNA evidence, noting that the biological profile indicated the attacker was female. Her report made its way through several layers of bureaucracy before landing on the desk of Detective Supervisor Captain Morrison. He called Francis into his office for what turned out to be a brief and uncomfortable meeting. This DNA result, Morrison said, holding up her report. It says the suspect is female. That's correct, Francis replied. The genetic markers clearly indicate the sample came from a woman. But the case file says this was a burglary. Residential burglars are almost always male. Francis had anticipated this objection. That's exactly why I think the case should be re-examined. The DNA evidence contradicts the original theory. Maybe it wasn't a burglary after all. Morrison was quiet for a moment, studying the file. I see that the victim's family suspected an ex-girlfriend of the husband, someone named... He flipped through pages. Stephanie Lazarus says here she's LAPD. I noticed that too, Francis said carefully. Given that the suspect appears to be female and there was already a female person of interest identified by the family, it might be worth... Ms. Francis, Morrison interrupted. I appreciate your thoroughness, but we don't investigate our own people based on speculation and family rumors. This Lazarus woman has been with the department for years. She's never been a suspect in anything. Frances felt her professional enthusiasm deflating. On the but sir, the DNA evidence will be preserved and available if we ever develop a legitimate suspect in this case, Morrison said, closing the file. Until then, this remains a cold case burglary. That afternoon, Frances returned the bite mark swab to its storage location in the crime lab freezer, where it would wait another 4 years for someone willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. Detective Jim Nuttall was looking for a different case entirely when he found the Rasmussen murder book sitting on the floor of the cold case storage room in 2008. He had been searching for files on an armed robbery series from the 1990s when he noticed the thick folder that someone had apparently knocked off a shelf and forgotten to replace. Nuttall was a 20-year veteran of the LAPD, a methodical investigator who had built his reputation on solving cases that other detectives had given up on. He picked up the wayward file, intending to put it back where it belonged, but something about the crime scene photographs made him pause. He flipped through the initial reports, studying the images of stacked electronics, scattered papers, and a victim who had clearly fought for her life. "Pete," he called to his partner, Detective Pete Barba. "Come look at this." Barba walked over and examined the photos over Nuttall's shoulder. Like his partner, he was an experienced cold case detective with an eye for details that didn't fit standard patterns. What he saw in the Rasmussen file immediately captured his attention. "This is supposed to be a burglary?" Barba asked, studying an image of the ransacked living room. "That's what it says," Nuttall replied. "But look at this. Jewelry box on the dresser, completely untouched. Expensive watch on the bathroom counter, still there. Electronics stacked by the door, like someone was staging a scene rather than actually stealing anything." They spent the rest of the day reading through the complete file. The more they learned about the case, the more convinced they became that the original investigation had missed something fundamental. The victim was a competent, physically strong nurse who wouldn't have been easily overpowered by a random burglar. The crime scene showed evidence of a prolonged struggle. Most significantly, there was a bite mark with DNA evidence that had never been properly investigated. "Look at this," Barba said, holding up a report from the crime lab. "DNA from the bite mark shows the attacker was female. How many female burglars you know who bite their victims?" Nuttall was reading through the family interviews, paying particular attention to their repeated mentions of Stephanie Lazarus. The parents were convinced it was the husband's ex-girlfriend. LAPD officer, original detectives dismissed it without any real investigation. "Maybe because she was one of us," Barbara suggested quietly. They looked at each other with the understanding that comes from years of partnership. They both knew what they had found, a case that had been mishandled, possibly deliberately, and a family that had been ignored when they tried to point investigators in the right direction. "We start from zero," Nuttall said. "Forget everything the original detectives concluded. Look at the evidence fresh and see where it takes us." It was a decision that would change both their careers and finally give Sherri Rasmussen the investigation she had deserved from the beginning. Rebuilding the Rasmussen case from scratch took Detectives Nuttall and Barba 3 months of painstaking work. They re-interviewed John Ruetten, revisited the crime scene, and carefully reviewed every piece of physical evidence. What emerged was a picture completely different from the botched burglary that had been sold to Sherri's family for over 20 years. The supposed burglary made no sense when examined closely. The electronics were neatly stacked, not hastily grabbed. The expensive items that any real burglar would have taken immediately, jewelry, cash, portable electronics, were left untouched. The BMW was taken, but not until after the murder, suggesting the car theft was meant to support the burglary narrative, rather than being the actual motive for the crime. Most telling was the pattern of violence. Sherri had been shot 3 times with a .38 caliber weapon, but she had also been beaten and bitten during what appeared to be a prolonged fight. This wasn't the quick, efficient violence of a burglar surprised by an unexpected victim. This was personal, emotional, the kind of rage-driven attack that spoke to a deeper motive than theft. This was someone who knew her, Nuttall observed, studying crime scene photos for the 100th time. Someone who came here specifically to confront Sherri Rasmussen. Someone who brought a gun and was prepared to use it. The DNA evidence from the bite mark provided their most important clue. The genetic profile was complete and clear, preserved perfectly after all these years in storage. All they needed was a suspect to compare it against. Based on their analysis of the case, they compiled a list of 5 women who had reasons to want Sherri Rasmussen dead. The list included a coworker who had been passed over for a promotion that went to Sherri, a neighbor who had complained about noise from the condo, John's sister-in-law with whom Sherri had argued at the wedding, a patient's family member who had filed a complaint against Sherri, and finally Stephanie Lazarus. One by one, they eliminated the other women. The co-worker had been at work with dozens of witnesses on February 24, 1986. The neighbor had moved to Oregon 2 months before the murder. John's sister-in-law lived in Northern California and had credit card receipts placing her in San Francisco the day of the crime. The patient's family member had been ruled out by the original investigators through phone records and witness statements that left Stephanie Lazarus. When Nuttall and Barba pulled her personnel file, they found a decorated officer with commendations for marksmanship and hand-to-hand combat training. Her assigned weapon was a .38 caliber revolver identical to the type used in Sherri's murder. She lived 20 minutes from the crime scene and would have known the victim's daily routines through her relationship with John. "She's our number 5, Barba said, using the code name they had assigned to avoid saying Lazarus's name aloud in the squad room. But how do we get a DNA sample from a fellow cop without tipping her off? The answer would come from an unexpected source, Stephanie Lazarus's own carelessness and a suburban Costco parking lot. The surveillance operation began in December 2008. Detectives Nuttall and Barba, working with a small team of investigators who had been cleared by internal affairs, began monitoring Stephanie Lazarus's daily routines. They learned that she lived in Simi Valley with her husband and daughter, that she shopped regularly at a Costco near her home, and that she had a habit of buying large coffee drinks that she would consume during her shopping trips. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would wait for an opportunity when Lazarus disposed of a cup or bottle that contained her saliva, collect it without her knowledge, and have the DNA tested against the bite mark sample. It was completely legal. Once someone throws something in a public trash bin, they have no reasonable expectation of privacy regarding its contents. On January 5, 2009, the opportunity finally came. Lazarus entered the Simi Valley Costco at 2:15 p.m., purchased a large coffee at the food court, and spent 45 minutes shopping for household supplies. As she walked to her car, she finished the drink and threw the empty cup into a trash bin in the parking lot. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been assigned to the surveillance team, waited until Lazarus drove away, then retrieved the cup and placed it in an evidence bag. The chain of custody was carefully documented, with photographs showing the exact location where the cup was found and signed statements from all officers involved in the collection. The DNA lab processed the sample within 48 hours. When the results came back, Nuttall and Barba sat in stunned silence, even though they had been expecting this outcome for months. The genetic profile from the coffee cup was a perfect match to the DNA found in Sherri Rasmussen's bite mark. After 23 years, they had their killer. But having the evidence and making an arrest were 2 different things. Stephanie Lazarus was still an active LAPD detective, with friends and allies throughout the department. Any move against her would have to be carefully planned and perfectly executed. One mistake, one leak, one moment of hesitation, and she could destroy evidence, flee the jurisdiction, or use her insider knowledge to stay one step ahead of the investigation. Captain Morrison, the same supervisor who had dismissed Jennifer Francis's concerns 5 years earlier, was now faced with undeniable proof that one of his detectives was a murderer. The meeting where Nuttall and Barba presented their findings was tense and uncomfortable, filled with long silences and careful questions about the strength of their evidence. "You're absolutely certain about this match?" Morrison asked, studying the DNA report. "Absolutely certain," Nuttall replied. "The probability of error is less than 1 in a billion." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then we move forward. But this stays completely confidential until we have her in custody. One word of this leaks and she disappears forever." The Parker Center sting operation was designed to get Stephanie Lazarus into a controlled environment where she could be arrested safely, away from her weapon and without the opportunity to flee. The plan involved inviting her to LAPD headquarters under the pretense of consulting on an art theft case, something that fell within her area of expertise and wouldn't seem suspicious. On June 5, 2009, Lazarus received a call from Detective Martinez in the downtown division, asking if she could come in to look at some photographs related to a burglary at a Beverly Hills gallery. It was exactly the kind of consultation request she received regularly, and she agreed to meet that afternoon. Lazarus arrived at Parker Center at 3:00 p.m., dressed in casual clothes since she was officially off duty. Following standard security procedures, she checked her service weapon at the front desk and was escorted to an interview room on the 3rd floor. She believed she was there to help with someone else's case. She had no idea she was walking into her own arrest. Detectives Nuttall and Barba entered the room carrying a folder of photographs, but their real purpose was to get Lazarus talking about her past relationship with John Ruetten and her knowledge of Sherri Rasmussen's murder. They started with routine questions about art theft techniques, then gradually steered the conversation toward the 1986 case. "We're actually looking at some older cases too," Nuttall said casually. "There was a burglary in Van Nuys back in '86 where the victim was killed, Sherri Rasmussen. You might remember it. She was married to a guy named John Ruetten." Lazarus' demeanor changed subtly. Her posture stiffened slightly and she took a moment before answering. "John Ruetten? Yeah, I knew John. We dated for a while before he got married. Terrible thing that happened to his wife." "Did you know her, Sherri?" Barba asked. "Not really. I mean, I met her a few times. She seemed nice." Lazarus was being careful now, measuring her words. "Why are you asking about this? I thought this was about art theft." The detectives continued their careful questioning for another hour, letting Lazarus dig herself deeper into a web of small lies and contradictions. She claimed to barely remember Sherri, then mentioned specific details about her nursing career. She said she hadn't spoken to John in years, then described recent conversations with him. She insisted she had never been to their condo, then corrected herself to say she might have stopped by once. Finally, Nuttall played his strongest card. "Stephanie, we have DNA evidence from the crime scene. Would you be willing to provide a sample so we can eliminate you as a suspect?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Lazarus stared at the detectives, her cop instincts finally recognizing that she wasn't helping with an investigation. She was the target of one. "I think I need to call my attorney," she said, standing up. "That's your right," Nuttall replied. "But before you go, I need to tell you that you're under arrest for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen." The search of Stephanie Lazarus's Simi Valley home began at dawn, the day after her arrest. Armed with warrants signed by a judge who had been briefed on the DNA evidence, detectives combed through 23 years of accumulated possessions, looking for anything that might connect her to Sherri Rasmussen's murder. In a bedroom closet, they found a box of journals and diaries dating back to the 1980. The entries made for chilling reading, revealing an obsessive fixation on John Ruetten that had persisted long after their romantic relationship had ended. There were detailed descriptions of following him to restaurants, driving by his workplace, and researching information about his new wife. One entry, dated February 15, 1986, 9 days before the murder, was particularly disturbing. Saw J&S at the grocery store today. She doesn't deserve him. She'll never love him the way I do. Someone needs to show her that she can't just waltz into his life and take what doesn't belong to her. The investigators also found computer printouts showing internet searches conducted in recent years for information about John Ruetten, his current address, his employment history, and news articles about unsolved murders in Los Angeles. It was clear that Lazarus had never stopped monitoring her former boyfriend's life, even decades after Sherri's death. Perhaps most damning was a receipt from a sporting goods store dated February 20, 1986, showing the purchase of ammunition compatible with the .38 caliber weapon used in the murder. Lazarus had bought the bullets 4 days before Sherri died. The LAPD was in crisis. One of their own had been arrested for murder, and the circumstances suggested that the original investigation had been either incompetent or deliberately sabotaged to protect a fellow officer. Internal Affairs launched a comprehensive review of everyone who had worked the case, looking for evidence of corruption or cover-up. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. The story had everything that captured public attention: a decorated police officer living a double life, a cold case solved by advances in DNA technology, a grieving family's decades-long fight for justice finally vindicated. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that their daughter's killer had finally been caught, and anger that it had taken 23 years for anyone in law enforcement to take their suspicions seriously. "We told them from the very beginning," Nels said at a press conference outside LAPD headquarters. "We gave them her name, we explained her motive, we begged them to investigate. They didn't want to hear it because she was one of them." How many other families are out there, still waiting for justice because the system protects its own? The questions raised by Nels Rasmussen would hang over the LAPD for years to come. The legal battle surrounding Stephanie Lazarus's case stretched from 2009 to 2012. As her defense team filed motion after motion, attempting to suppress evidence and delay the trial. They argued that the DNA sample from the coffee cup had been obtained illegally, that the 1986 evidence had been contaminated, and that their client's civil rights had been violated during the Parker Center interview. Judge Robert Perry, who presided over the pretrial hearings, denied most of the defense motions. The coffee cup had been legally obtained from a public trash bin. The DNA evidence had been properly preserved and tested using accepted scientific methods. Lazarus had been read her Miranda rights and had voluntarily participated in the interview until she chose to stop talking. The defense also tried to argue that too much time had passed for a fair trial, that witnesses' memories had faded, and that evidence had been lost or destroyed, but prosecutors countered that it was Lazarus's own position within the LAPD that had delayed justice for so long, and that she shouldn't be allowed to benefit from the system's failure to investigate her properly in the first place. During the discovery process, more damaging evidence emerged. Phone records from 1986 showed that Lazarus had called in sick to work on February 24, the day of the murder, claiming she had the flu, but her personnel file contained no other sick days in the months before or after, suggesting the illness had been fabricated to give her an alibi. Even more troubling, investigators found that evidence from the original case had mysteriously disappeared over the years. The audio tape of Nels Rasmussen's first interview with police was missing, Photographs from the crime scene had been misfiled and only rediscovered after the arrest. Notes taken by the original detectives had vanished from the murder book. The pattern suggested that someone with access to the evidence storage facility had been systematically removing materials that might have pointed toward Lazarus as a suspect. While prosecutors couldn't prove that Lazarus herself had tampered with evidence, the circumstantial case for obstruction of justice was compelling. Public interest in the case intensified as the trial date approached. Court TV announced plans to broadcast the proceedings live. True crime podcasters dissected every detail of the investigation. The story became a symbol of institutional corruption and the power of DNA evidence to solve cold cases. For the Rasmussen family, the approaching trial meant reliving the worst day of their lives in public, but it also meant the possibility of finally hearing the truth about what had happened to Sherri. They had waited 26 years for this moment, and they were determined to see justice done, regardless of how painful the process might be. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus began on February 6, 2012 in a packed Los Angeles courtroom. Prosecutor Shannon Presby opened with a simple but devastating summary. This case is about a bite, a bullet, and a broken heart. The defendant bit the victim, shot her 3 times, and did it all because she couldn't accept that John Ruetten had chosen someone else. The prosecution's case was methodical and compelling. They walked the jury through the timeline of February 24, 1986, showing how Lazarus had called in sick to work, driven to the Balboa Boulevard condo, and confronted Sherri Rasmussen in what escalated to murder. The DNA evidence was presented with scientific precision, establishing beyond any doubt that Lazarus had bitten the victim during the struggle. John Ruetten's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution case. Now in his 50s, graying and obviously uncomfortable with the public attention, he described his relationship with both women, the warning signs he had ignored, and the guilt he had carried for decades. "I should have done more to protect Sherri," he said, his voice breaking. "I knew Stephanie was having trouble accepting that we were over, but I never imagined she would hurt anyone." Defense attorney Mark Overland faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence was unshakable, the motive was clear, and his client had lied repeatedly during her police interview. His strategy focused on attacking the integrity of the evidence and suggesting that the LAPD had targeted Lazarus to cover up their own investigative failures. "This evidence sat in a freezer for 23 years, Overland argued. "How do we know it wasn't contaminated? How do we know it wasn't tampered with by people who needed a scapegoat for their own mistakes?" But the scientific testimony was overwhelming. DNA expert Dr. Jennifer Mihailovich explained that genetic material can remain stable for decades when properly preserved, and that the bite mark sample had been handled according to standard forensic protocols throughout its storage period. The defense also tried to present alternative theories of the crime, suggesting that the real killer was still out there and that Lazarus was being framed. But they couldn't explain how someone else's DNA had gotten mixed with Lazarus's saliva, or why she had lied about her whereabouts on the day of the murder. Lazarus herself never testified, exercising her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But her recorded interview from Parker Center was played for the jury, allowing them to hear her evasive answers and contradictory statements in her own voice. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on February 27, 2012. The deliberations lasted just 1 day. When the jurors returned to the courtroom, their faces were grim as they announced their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Perry sentenced Stephanie Lazarus to 27 years to life in state prison, noting that she had used her position as a police officer to commit and cover up her crime, making her betrayal of public trust especially egregious. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus was upheld by the California Court of Appeals in 2015, despite defense arguments that the trial had been unfair and the evidence unreliable. The appellate court found that the DNA evidence had been properly collected and tested, that Lazarus had received competent legal representation, and that the jury's verdict was supported by overwhelming evidence of guilt. But the case continued to generate controversy and questions about the LAPD's handling of the original investigation. Journalists began investigating how many other cases might have been compromised by corruption or incompetence, and whether other officers had used their positions to cover up crimes. The missing evidence from the Rasmussen case became a particular focus of scrutiny. Internal affairs investigators concluded that the disappearances were too systematic and convenient to be accidental, but they were never able to identify who was responsible for removing the materials. Several retired detectives who had worked the case refused to cooperate with the investigation, citing their Fifth Amendment rights. Civil rights attorneys filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Rasmussen family, alleging that the LAPD had deliberately obstructed the investigation to protect one of their own. The city eventually settled the case for an undisclosed amount, while admitting no wrongdoing. The Lazarus case became a catalyst for reforms within the LAPD, including new protocols for investigating crimes where police officers are potential suspects, and better oversight of evidence storage facilities. DNA testing became standard for all cold cases involving biological evidence, leading to dozens of additional arrests in previously unsolved murders. For true crime enthusiasts, the case became a landmark example of how advances in forensic science could overcome institutional resistance to solving difficult cases. Podcasters, documentarians, and authors dissected every aspect of the investigation, turning Sherri Rasmussen's murder into one of the most studied cold cases in American history. But for all the attention and analysis, one question remained unanswered. Why had Stephanie Lazarus waited so long to act on her obsession with John Ruetten? What had finally pushed her from stalking and harassment to murder on that February morning in 1986? The answer would not come for another 8 years, when Lazarus finally broke her silence at her first parole hearing in 2023. The parole hearing took place on March 15, 2023, in a sterile conference room at the California Institution for Women in Corona. Stephanie Lazarus, now 62 years old with gray hair and wearing prison clothing, sat across from a panel of 3 parole commissioners who would decide whether she was ready for release after serving 14 years of her sentence. For the first time since her arrest, Lazarus spoke publicly about the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Her voice was steady but emotional as she finally admitted what she had denied for decades. "I killed Sherri Rasmussen," she said, looking directly at the commissioners. "I went to her house that morning intending to confront her about John. I wanted to convince her to let him go, to step aside so we could be together, but she refused to listen. She told me I was crazy, that John would never come back to me. We fought, and I lost control." The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Nels Rasmussen, now 89 years old and using a wheelchair, had traveled from Arizona with Loretta to oppose Lazarus's parole. Despite his advanced age, his voice was strong as he addressed the panel. "She took our daughter away from us," he said, his words carrying the weight of 37 years of grief. "She destroyed our family, and she's never shown genuine remorse until today, when it might help her get out of prison. Sherri was just starting her life. She had so much to give to the world, and this woman took all of that away because she couldn't accept rejection." Loretta, now 86, spoke more quietly, but with equal determination. "I think about Sherri every day. I wonder what kind of nurse she would have become, whether we would have had grandchildren, what her voice would sound like now. We'll never know any of that because of what she did." The parole commissioners asked Lazarus detailed questions about her actions in 1986, her subsequent cover-up, and her plans for reintegration into society if released. Her answers were careful and rehearsed, focusing on her remorse and rehabilitation programs she had completed in prison. In a surprising decision that stunned legal observers, The parole panel voted 2-1 to grant Lazarus parole, effective in 6 months. The decision was based partly on her clean prison record, her admission of guilt, and the standard assumption that first-time offenders who had served substantial sentences posed minimal risk to public safety. But the decision triggered an immediate backlash. Victims' rights groups protested outside the prison. The Rasmussen family's attorney filed an appeal. Media coverage was overwhelmingly negative, focusing on the brutality of the original crime and Lazarus's decades of deception. Under pressure from public outcry and political opposition, the full California Parole Board voted in December 2023 to rescind the initial grant of parole, citing concerns about the inmate's credibility and the seriousness of the commitment offense. Lazarus would have to wait at least 3 more years before becoming eligible for another parole hearing. The 2024 reversal of Stephanie Lazarus's parole grant brought the case back into national headlines and renewed questions about the justice system's handling of police officers who commit crimes. Legal experts debated whether Lazarus was being held to a higher standard because of her former profession, or whether the system was finally holding her accountable for the abuse of power that had allowed her to escape justice for so long. In prison interviews with journalists, Lazarus expressed frustration with what she called the political nature of her parole process. She claimed that her confession at the 2023 hearing had been genuine, motivated by a desire to finally take responsibility for her actions rather than by any calculation about potential release. "I know what I did was terrible," she told a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. "I've had 37 years to think about it, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't regret what happened. But at some point, society has to decide whether punishment is about rehabilitation or just revenge." The Rasmussen family, meanwhile, continued their long vigil for justice. Nels, despite his advanced age and declining health, remained actively involved in victims' rights advocacy, speaking at conferences and supporting other families dealing with unsolved murders. His dedication to his daughter's memory had become legendary within law enforcement circles. Cold case detectives across the country cited the Rasmussen investigation as a model for how advances in forensic science could overcome institutional resistance and solve seemingly impossible cases. The techniques used by Nuttall and Barbie, careful scene reconstruction, systematic elimination of suspects, and covert DNA collection became standard practices taught in police academies. The case also sparked broader discussions about the blue wall of silence that had protected Lazarus for decades. Police departments nationwide implemented new policies requiring outside oversight when officers become suspects in criminal investigations, recognizing that internal bias could compromise the pursuit of justice. Jennifer Francis, the criminalist who had first identified the female DNA in 2004, became a sought-after speaker at forensic conferences, emphasizing the importance of following scientific evidence even when it contradicts official theories or institutional preferences. Her persistence in advocating for renewed investigation, despite bureaucratic resistance, inspired a new generation of forensic scientists. John Ruetten, now remarried and living quietly in Northern California, rarely spoke publicly about the case, but had testified at every parole hearing to ensure that Lazarus remained incarcerated. The guilt he carried for not recognizing the danger signs in Stephanie's behavior had shaped the rest of his life, making him an advocate for domestic violence awareness and stalking prevention programs. By 2025, Stephanie Lazarus had served 16 years of her 27 years to life sentence and was eligible for another parole hearing. The proceeding, held on a cold January morning at the California Institution for Women, would prove to be dramatically different from her previous appearance before the board. This time the commissioners came prepared with detailed questions about inconsistencies in Lazarus's 2023 confession. He had spent months reviewing transcripts, crime scene evidence, and witness statements, looking for contradictions between her admitted version of events and the physical evidence from the murder scene. Commissioner Janet Rodriguez led the questioning with prosecutorial precision. Mrs. Lazarus, in your previous hearing you claimed that you went to the victim's home intending to talk and that the violence escalated when she refused to listen to you. But the evidence shows that you brought a gun to the confrontation. How do you explain that? Lazarus shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I always carried my service weapon. It was standard procedure for off-duty officers. But you had called in sick that day. Commissioner Rodriguez pressed. You weren't on duty, and ballistics evidence shows that the bullets that killed Mrs. Rasmussen came from a .38 caliber weapon, not your assigned service pistol. You purchased a backup weapon specifically for this crime, didn't you? The questions continued for 2 hours, methodically dismantling Lazarus's carefully constructed narrative. The commissioners had done their homework, consulting with forensic experts who explained how the crime scene evidence contradicted key elements of her confession. Dr. Michael Baden, the renowned forensic pathologist, had reviewed the case files and testified via video link that the pattern of injuries on Sherri Rasmussen's body indicated a prolonged, vicious attack that went far beyond a confrontation that had gotten out of hand. This was not a crime of passion, Dr. Baden explained to the panel. The evidence shows systematic violence, beating, biting, and finally execution-style gunshots. This was someone who intended to kill from the moment they entered that house. Nels Rasmussen, now 91 but still determined to see justice done, attended the hearing with his son. His statement to the board was brief but powerful. She's had almost 40 years to think about what she did to our daughter. She's had 16 years in prison to come up with a story that makes her look sympathetic, but the evidence doesn't lie. She went there to murder Sherri, and that's exactly what she did. After deliberating for 6 hours, the parole board announced their unanimous decision. Paroled, and the commissioners cited Lazarus's continued minimization of her crimes, the premeditated nature of the murder, and her decades of deception as factors that made her unsuitable for release. Commissioner Rodriguez read the formal decision. The board finds that the inmate continues to pose an unreasonable risk to public safety. Her version of events is not credible when compared to the physical evidence, and her acceptance of responsibility appears to be calculated rather than genuine. Parole is denied for a period of 5 years. In the months following the 2025 parole denial, the Rasmussen case achieved a kind of closure that had seemed impossible for decades. Nels and Loretta, both in their 90s, finally felt that the system had acknowledged not just their daughter's death, but the institutional failures that had delayed justice for so long. The case had become more than just another true crime story. It was a testament to the power of family persistence in the face of bureaucratic indifference, a vindication of scientific evidence over institutional bias, and a warning about how easily the system could be manipulated by those sworn to protect it. In victim impact statements submitted to the parole board, family members described how Sherri's murder had shaped 4 decades of their lives. Her younger brother wrote about the career in medicine he had abandoned because he couldn't bear to work in hospitals that reminded him of his sister. Her cousins talked about family gatherings that were forever marked by her absence, birthdays and holidays shadowed by grief and anger. But they also wrote about the positive changes that had emerged from tragedy. The Sherri Rasmussen Scholarship Fund had provided financial assistance to dozens of nursing students. Advocacy efforts inspired by their fight had led to policy changes in police departments across the country. Their refusal to accept easy answers had encouraged other families to keep pushing for justice in their own cold cases. Detective Jim Nuttall, now retired, often reflected on how different his career might have been if he hadn't found that case file on the storage room floor in 2008. The Rasmussen investigation had defined his final years in law enforcement, proving that meticulous police work could overcome decades of institutional failure. The evidence was always there, he said in a 2025 interview. The bite mark, the DNA, The obvious problems with the burglary theory. It was all sitting in that file, waiting for someone to take it seriously. What this case really proves is that families know things that investigators sometimes don't want to hear. They live with these crimes every day. They see patterns that outsiders miss. We should listen to them. Jennifer Francis, the criminalist whose DNA work had finally cracked the case, became a national expert on cold case forensics. She frequently testified before legislative committees about the importance of properly preserving biological evidence and the need for independent oversight of police crime labs. The Costco cup that had provided the breakthrough DNA sample was preserved as evidence, a mundane object that had carried extraordinary significance. It served as a reminder that justice could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, that truth could be found in discarded trash, and that scientific evidence could speak for victims who had been silenced. On a quiet afternoon in late 2025, Nels Rasmussen sat in his Tucson living room, surrounded by boxes of files, newspaper clippings, and legal documents that chronicled nearly 4 decades of fighting for justice. At 91, he moved slowly but remained mentally sharp, his memory for details about his daughter's case as precise as it had been in 1986. The room was filled with reminders of Sherri, photographs from her nursing school graduation, awards from her UCLA Medical Center colleagues, letters from patients whose lives she had touched during her brief but impactful career. On the mantel sat a framed photo of her from their last Christmas together, smiling with the confident warmth that everyone who knew her remembered. Loretta, also 91, spent her afternoons going through Sherri's belongings, items they had kept stored in closets and boxes for all these years. There were textbooks from nursing school, carefully annotated in Sherri's precise handwriting, recipes she had copied from her mother, planning for the family dinners she would never host, a wedding dress, preserved in tissue paper that she had worn for just one day. "People ask us if we feel closure now," Nell said, his voice still strong despite his age. "I tell them that closure isn't the right word. Sherri is still gone. We still think about her every day. What we have now is justice, and that's different." Justice means that the person who killed our daughter is in prison where she belongs and the world knows the truth about what happened. The recordings of Nels's early phone calls with Detective Mayer had been preserved in the case files, and they were occasionally played at police training seminars as examples of how investigators should respond to family concerns. His voice from 1986, desperate and persistent, asking why the LAPD wouldn't investigate Stephanie Lazarus, had become a teaching tool about the importance of following all leads, regardless of how inconvenient they might be. She wanted to destroy the beauty that Sherri exuded, Nels had said during one of those early calls, his words proving prophetic decades later. She couldn't stand that Sherri was everything she wasn't, kind, genuine, loved by everyone who knew her. That jealousy ate at her until it turned into something murderous. The case files would eventually be donated to the International Association of Chiefs of Police as part of their cold case training materials, ensuring that future investigators would learn from the mistakes and eventual success of the Rasmussen investigation. The story would be taught in police academies, law schools, and forensic science programs as a comprehensive example of how cases should and should not be handled. But for Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the most important legacy was simpler. Their daughter had not been forgotten. Her voice, silenced by violence in 1986, had finally been heard through the persistence of family, the dedication of honest investigators, and the inexorable power of scientific truth. In the quiet of their Tucson home, surrounded by memories of a life cut short, they continued their daily ritual of remembering Sherri not as a victim, but as the brilliant, compassionate woman she had been during her 29 years on Earth.